Really happy to be here, and I'm particularly happy to follow my colleague Ted, because one of the things I'm really interested in is seeing what we can learn about Dick from a perspective of religious studies, the history of religion, theology, the dynamics of mysticism, rather than approaching things in terms of the literary questions. And I want to start out, I'm mostly going to read my paper because I want to be specific about a number of points, but basically I'll just start out saying that I'm interested in the religious problem of Philip K. Dick. And what do I mean by the problem? Well, one is just the general problem of religion. What is it? Why does it stay with us? How do we account for it? Can we look to neuroscience as ways to explain the dynamics of religious experience that allows us to sort of avoid the meaning claims that people make with religion? That's a very interesting question. How is it that people find themselves with religion? How do they negotiate it? How do they reframe what it means? Even the question that Ted raised very well, which is this kind of bugaboo, is like, what is a Christian? What does it mean to say somebody is a Christian? Is a Christian? With McKee, who is a Christian, it's very clear there's a kind of partisan quality to it, where he wants Dick to be Christian in a way to support a certain kind of theological perspective, which in many ways I have a good deal of sympathy with. But it also reflects some specific things about Christianity, which is particularly its exclusive characteristic. But of course, from a religious studies perspective, that is a perspective that's interested in anthropology and psychology and history, that has a more secular approach to these issues, you can't talk about Christianity. There are Christianities. And one of these Christianities, or a body of them, is precisely the Gnostic trend that Ted is talking about. In fact, the idea that there is a conflict between Gnosticism over here and Christianity over here is itself precisely a historical remnant of Christianity, of Orthodox Christianity's attempt to define itself against its others. But the actual matrix of Gnosticism is thoroughly bound up with precisely the same historical, cultural, and religious matrix that leads to Orthodox Christianity. So I'm really glad that these questions have been raised. So if one of the things that I'm interested in is the problem of religion with Philip K. Dick, is that what I love as a student of religion is how many wonderful ways that his peculiar experiences let us look at these problems. How is it that people construct belief? How is it that people interpret religious experience? Usually we think about religious experience as being some kind of clear event that then people have, okay, I got it, now I'm a Christian, or now I'm a Gnostic, or now I'm a believer in shamanic entities. But with Dick, you have this fascinating situation where there's clearly something happens, something extraordinary happens. It's not sufficient to create a purely biological narrative about temporal lobe epilepsy as a way to write off these experiences. Something extraordinary happens to him. But then what does he do with it? How does he make meaning with it? How does he frame it and reframe it and narrate himself into a kind of a set of religious positions? So it's those two questions. How does Dick help us understand the problem of religion in general in a very interesting, very unique way, which may or may not be interesting to you if you're not, depending on your degree of interest in religion in general. But the second question, of course, is how do we deal with this in terms of Dick? Like, how does this religious dimension of his experiences, of his writings, of his obsessions, impact the way that we read his fiction and the way that we assess him in general? And the very simple way to pose this question, which is something that all of us are going to be wrestling with on one way or another, is what the fuck do we do with the exegesis? What do you do with this thing? I worked on it. I don't understand it. It's a nightmare. It's crazy. It goes on and on. It's terrible. Even the thing that we publish is way too long. It's too bad, So what do you do with this thing? You can't ignore it. It's the elephant in the room. So what I'm going to do is kind of play with some of these questions and looking at how people thinking about Dick have tried to deal with this problem of where you draw a line. So a good example of this problem arises in Christopher Palmer's discussion of the novel VALIS. He recognizes the religious aspect of the text, the way that the religious discourse is part of this hydra-headed monster of genres that makes up VALIS, but he's troubled by it. I would say even he's sort of confused by it. On the one hand, he wants to talk about Fat's sort of entrance into essentially the exegetical model of referring to all of these different religious figures and changing his minds. And Palmer describes this as a retreat into textuality. He uses this kind of postmodern idea of textuality, text simply referring to other texts. And he sees this as an indice of Fat's removal from material reality, from issues with other people, as a kind of retreat into textuality. Okay, that's fine. There's a certain kind of, he talks about the postmodern restlessness of his constant searching for new kinds of theories. Fine, whatever. But from a religious studies perspective, you're like, that's missing the boat, because that kind of thinking, that way of analyzing and comparing different perspectives, is itself a deeply ingrained part of religious thinking. In the modern context, we have thinkers like Mircea Eliade and Carl Jung, both of whom are comparativists. That means that they're interested in saying, what can we say about religion that appears and crosses in very different genres? We can go and look at tribal practices in Africa, we can look at Neoplatonism, we can look at contemporary experiences in Baptist churches, and we find commonalities. We begin to compare. We find archetypal similarities. Now, Dick read these authors very deeply, and in a way, they gave him permission to proceed on a certain kind of globalized, multidimensional, hydra-headed religious thinking that anybody who's familiar with the literature of the New Age, or the literature going back to, let's say, Madame Blavatsky in the late 19th century, who also created these enormous texts where vast swaths of half understood, half misunderstood archetypal and religious lore are compared and woven together in these changing kinds of scenarios. So it's that kind of thinking, this retreat into textuality, is actually an affirmation of a certain way of moving through the inherited global tradition of religion that Dick is very much furthering. In some ways, he's acting as a comparative religious scholar, albeit an eccentric one, more of a garage philosopher than, of course, a credentialed intellectual. But the other aspect of this idea of retreat into textuality is that within esotericism, within mysticism, within hermeticism, there are very strong, powerful ideas of the text. The text isn't just some practice that we do and reproduce with presses, and then we read it with our brains. Behind this, we have images of the logos, of the word, of the Torah, ideas that were very important to Dick as ways of modeling what this vast information system was. So you have to see this kind of intense, feverish textuality that he turns to, that Fat turns to in the novel, and that, of course, Dick deeply dove into in his own work, as indices of a kind of a sense of what language is, or how signs interact, that has itself a profound spiritual, esoteric, or occult dimension to it. There's another, so if on the one hand, Palmer talks about this retreat into textuality, which I think he misreads, he does not understand the religious depths of it. On the other hand, paradoxically or confusedly, he says that VALIS is problematic precisely because it tries to deny its textuality. What does he mean by that? Well, Palmer's very threatened by the fact that, Philip K. Dick might actually believe in VALIS, whatever that means. And that this belief, this kind of uncomfortable proximity to a religious belief undermines or infects the novel's own status as a kind of novel, in the sense that he fears that it becomes almost a kind of religious tract. So it's a weird argument. On the one hand, we have a retreat into textuality, and on the other hand, we have this sort of uncomfortable proximity to actual religious belief, the problem of religion. A good example of the way in which the religious dimension of Philip K. Dick's experience forces us to go beyond purely literary questions. Palmer, he talks about the scene in VALIS where Philip, gives the sacraments to his child with the hot dog bun and the hot chocolate. And Palmer says this is not a convincing scene. It's not a convincing example of the way that Dick mixes material objects with larger philosophical issues. But of course, if you know the biography, you're like, well, whether or not it's convincing is kind of beside the point, because Dick actually did this. So then the question is, you can't avoid that. You can't say, oh, well, no, we can draw a line, a strict line between these worlds. You're like, no, you can't really do that, because the question changes. Then the question is, why would Dick include this clearly, possibly ridiculous, absurd action as part of his self-representation or self-play within VALIS, which is so complicated in the way in which he's playing through his own self? And behind that question is, what could possibly be the religious meaning? How do we really understand this very peculiar action from a religious studies perspective, or from an interest in ritual? The way I look at it, the reason I think he puts it in there is it's a beautiful example of the God in the gutter, of the coincidentia oppositorum in Eliade's terms, or Jung's terms. So Jung, both Eliade and Jung had this idea that part of the sacred is not like the sacred's over here and the profane is over here, but that they interact. And that in fact what you find in the sacred is this really weird fusion of the two, which is perfectly represented in this potentially absurd ritual that nonetheless has, or potentially has, an actual religious force. You know, Dick himself goes later on to a priest and says, did that have any meaning, or was I just blowing it? And the priest is like, no, actually, under certain extreme circumstances, you can go through the sacraments using whatever things you have. So he's clearly interested in it as an actual religious phenomenon. I think that Palmer's problem, the religious problem, the way it produces anxiety for him, and I think it produces anxiety for us all in various different ways, is summed up when he says, VALIS is a wonderful novel, but Scientology began in science fiction. Now, it's not really true about Scientology. It's much more complicated, Scientology's relationship to science fiction. And Scientology's relationship to Philip Dick is actually very interesting in certain ways that I will leave aside. But more what I'm interested in is how the proximity to Philip K. Dick's own beliefs or experiences infects and causes a certain kind of anxiety that demands a response that's familiar with these categories. Now, in his discussion of Palmer's reading, Umberto Rossi does a wonderful job where he says, look, Palmer wants to say that let's say the presence of apparent extracts from the exegesis at the end of VALIS, which actually none of which come directly from the exegesis, they're all rewritten, which is itself is an interesting thing to think about. The presence of this material raises the unnerving possibility that the whole novel VALIS is just a screen through which we are forced to confront Dick's actual belief. And Rossi has the beautiful, subtle, and much wiser move of saying, well, yes, but at the same time we can understand that Horselover Fat is himself a character that is a screen through which Philip K. Dick gets to look at his own beliefs, his own possible beliefs. And of course, this is a much richer way of understanding how the novel functions in a very unique way, as far as literature goes, as a way for Philip K. Dick to work through the meanings of his experiences. I think that another example to compare these ways, in a way what I'm talking about is the way that a very much of a literary approach can be sensitive to these religious issues without crossing a certain line, is that rather than look at the tractates as some kind of weird evidence of creepy proto-Scientological belief, Rossi actually just has the courage to risk their meaning by reading them. And he offers a very delightful reading of the final excerpt, which I won't go into, but just to say that what I think is happening with this question of what we do with the exegesis is that we have to have the courage to risk its meaningfulness, which means not just putting it into a barrel of this is his crazy rants, this is him venting, this is what he did to clear the gate so that he could actually turn and write the fiction that we care about, but instead we actually, in a way, have to have the guts to go into the problem itself. So, to kind of clarify this call, to read Dick fully, we must risk exegesis, even if such readings threaten to draw us into Dick's metaphysical game of the rat. So Palmer is right in a way. There is something evangelical to VALIS, and some of the other works as well. Not because it's packaging Dick's own dogmatic metaphysics, but because its form and rhetoric seeks to infect us with a kind of metafictional virus, modeling a way of reading that becomes attentive to ontological cracks and epistemological conundrums that inevitably open up an apophatic gap for the sacred. Apophatic meaning a certain way of approaching mysticism where rather than saying what God is, all you can say is what God isn't. He isn't this, he isn't this. In fact, he isn't anything that we can possibly think about. It's a way of creating a space for the sacred to arrive. And I think that Dick is trying to sort of allow those gaps to open up in our own readings by the way in which we're drawn into his metaphysical game. So as holy fools and grail knights slogging our way through VALIS, we are led not only to the empty chapel of the wasteland, but also to Robert Anton Wilson's Chapel Perilous, which in the mid-70s also ported his own conspiratorial fictions into the fabric of his lived experiences. Those of you not familiar with the Illuminatus trilogy, and particularly the Cosmic Trigger, it's a very, very important parallel to Dick's experiences that I think is underexplored. So when they go see the film VALIS, we're sitting there with them. We're sitting there with them, watching a Phil Dickian pulp science fiction, trying to put the pieces together, noticing that certain peripheral clues and images begin to link up together. But we're not really sure, are those linkages the labyrinth or the way out of the labyrinth? And so we get drawn into this maze, the maze that is alive, the maze of exegesis, of interpretation itself. So in that way, textuality is not some retreat into some arid space of self-referentiality, but textuality becomes a trickster logos, a kind of cybernetic pleroma within which interpretation is a hermeneutic loop that manifests or reflects our own perspectives. I think the sort of one of the great things about Dick, of course, is the way that not only he dramatizes philosophical problems, but the way that he brings problems into fable-like objects. You know, the Mercer box, or technologies which sort of create or hold together as kind of allegories of these problems. And the kind of reading that I'm talking about, a reading that can apply to the exegesis as well as to his fictions, is captured very much in the object of the holoscope in the Divine Invasion. Of course, this three-dimensional holographic Bible that allows you to sort of shift the object around from any angle, revealing these different connections in a way that opens up the interpretive possibilities of the text potentially infinitely. And in a way, what Dick is trying to do, and I think what he's working with in the exegesis, is to embody that kind of excess of interpretation. Is it overwhelming? Is it claustrophobic? Is it mad? Does it go on and on? Is it interminable? Yes, it is interminable. But it reminds me of a quote from Henri Bergson, who said that the mystic's discourse is interminable because the experience that he's talking about is ineffable. And that kind of interminability is very different than the one that goes, well, okay, this just goes on and on. Let's not, let's not read it on, let's not try to risk too much meaningfulness in it. So when I was working on the exegesis, which felt a lot of ways like being a grunt in some off-world salt mines of VALIS. We talked about the holoscope. It's like, in a way, we're like, what do you do with this crazy thing? Well, what would be great is if it was like some, three-dimensional online, entity that you could, go through at any different angle and throw it out there and let all the Knights Errant out there find their own, paths through this thing. Because, of course, the exegesis raises the religious problem of Philip K. Dick to a keening pitch, and especially this problem that keeps coming up about whether or not he was crazy. Now, we can talk a lot about what that means. What does it mean to offer a physiological, psychiatric description of him? Oh, he's bipolar, oh, he has temporal lobe epilepsy, and even farther, just what do we do with the kookiness of the text? Because there's no way you can read even the published exegesis and not go, this guy's kind of crazy. But if you read the stuff that's on the cutting room floor, I mean, tracks, miles of claustrophobic, disturbing, repetitive paranoia, you're like, this guy has some kind of mental illness. There's just no way around it. Now, my professor at Rice, where I'm getting my PhD, he makes, in a way, a very simple point that's so obvious and very clarifying in this matter, which he points out that if you look at the actual records of mystical experiences, paranormal experiences, synchronicities, encounters with God, encounters with spirits, encounters with ghosts. When you just look at the records that people leave of these experiences, whatever their ontological basis, that they often happen in relationship to trauma. They happen in car accidents, they happen in extreme psychological duress, they happen when people die, they happen when people are crazy. That is to say that mental illness is a kind of traumatic experience within which things happen, things which we can't necessarily reduce to the physiological wiring there. And so instead the question becomes not what is the event itself, but how does it mean? How is meaning constructed out of it? And one of the wonderful things about the exegesis is, of course, we get to watch Phil Dick construct and reconstruct and reframe and undermine and suggest alternative possibilities for this constantly evolving sense of the meaning of the sacred, or the presence of the sacred, the introduction of the sacred into his own life. So this raises this issue about, well, okay, but it's indeterminate. You know, from reading Lawrence Sutin, we kind of walk away with this idea that the ultimate message in the exegesis is its indeterminacy. That's it. You're never going to know. It's always going to have a different picture. There's always another theory around on the next page. But there's different ways to interpret that. So what do we do with that? The fact that that is the case with the exegesis. There is always another sort of interpretation around the page. Well, there's a kind of lazy nihilistic approach, which is like, well, we don't know, he didn't know, so let's just not really bother. Or there's the question of how is it that indeterminacy happens? Or rather, how does one practice philosophically, religiously, just as a human being, with the constant reiteration of indeterminacy? Well, that's a different question. How do you practice with indeterminacy? There's a beautiful passage towards the end of the exegesis, which is kind of interesting. You know, he didn't presumably know he was about to die, but a lot of the last year or so of passages are particularly powerful. And there's one where, in contradistinction to Gabriel McKee's claims, he goes, "This is it, I'm a Gnostic." And why does he say I'm a Gnostic? Because I'm convinced that epistemological questions are the source of it, and that all we really have is, what does he put it? An epistemological inquiry in itself, as a search, is truly divine. So that's the kind of Gnosticism I'm interested in. Not the Gnosticism that knows, now I've discovered the one, this is how the system works, this is how ontology works, this is what death is. But the Gnosticism which keeps throwing itself back into the indeterminacy with inquiry, but an inquiry that doesn't collapse itself into simple, skeptical, reductive accounts all the time. He may do that part of the time, and we see Dick do that regularly. That's part of what makes him such an interesting kind of religious figure. But it doesn't stop there either. So there's this kind of restless reinvestment in asking questions. But the other problem with this idea that it's all just about indeterminacy is it doesn't really pay attention to the diagrammatic rigor of what Dick was trying to do. You know, in that one of the interesting things about the exegesis, and I'm very happy that we were able to include a lot of these diagrams in the novels. There's all these little doodles, these weird little three-dimensional abstract diagrams of this different plane of reality and this layer, and this thing cuts across this plane, etc., etc. What's going on there? Well, I feel that on some level, maybe there's even a cognitive, scientific dimension to this. It's not clear, but that he's sort of working on the ways that different sorts of diagrams of forces produces different kinds of explanations for mystical experiences. And what I'd like to do for the last little chunk here before we open it up for questions is talk about one particular diagram that we're all going to know, even if we haven't read through the exegesis, which is the fish sign. The fish sign that produces and triggers event. Now, of course, the scene with the delivery woman and the fish sign and the trigger is of enormous importance for many, many reasons. Dick keeps returning to it. He re-narrates it. He narrates it in very different ways according to different people, sometimes quite dramatically. We have different accounts from tests, so we're never really going to know what actually happened. But what's important is the way that he keeps returning to this event over and over again. And so by reading the kind of narrative of the event, we get a sense of some of the dynamics that are going on in his actual religious experience, as well as the way that he's thinking about this religious experience. So I'm going to read an excerpt from the Exegesis that comes in February of 1982, so just shortly before his death. 274, light. Sunlight reflected off the golden fish sign. 374, VALIS, light. Beam of pink light is what I always say, but it was sunlight, as in 274, only this time it was the sticker of the fish sign in the living room window. The epsilon, one of the letters I'll explain in a second, became a palm tree. The pink part was the phosphine after image of the fish sticker. It's Christ. In 274, there was no pink light as such, but sunlight, fish sign and light. Like Burma, like Togo. So this is a beautiful, beautiful section because in earlier accounts, especially in the letters, he goes on and he tells this whole rich narrative. And you see the way that he keeps returning to this narrative almost as a ritual in itself. Because whatever VALIS means, whatever scenario he might be able to spin off of it, that happened. Something happened at that moment. So by returning to it, reiterating it, in a way it kind of ritually affirms it. It allows him to acknowledge revelation without having to actually explain what revelation is. You see this very much in terms of conversion narratives, born-again Christians. Born-again Christians will often return to their moment of conversion when they bottomed out, they reached the bottom, they lost their wife, they lost their job, they're addicted to drugs, and then they experience, through whatever mechanisms, this twisting shift of metanoia, of turning around, of the turn towards a conversion experience. And later on in their lives of Christians, when they realize they're still struggling, they still know what's going on, but everybody says there's Jesus, he's going to help you. Okay, sometimes you feel like he's there and maybe not, etc., etc. It's a whole process of becoming intimate with Christ. It's a lot more complicated than we see from the outside. But one of the things that people will constantly do is return to that moment of conversion, because in that moment there's a freshness, there's a crispness, there's a kind of change. Another thing that you see in his early accounts of the fish sign incident event is his use of other religious materials as a way to map and re-narrate what had happened. In particular, he turns to a text called The Hymn of the Pearl. And in another paper that I wrote, I go into a great deal of detail about what it was about this particular story, which is very beautiful, very short. I highly recommend that you go find it online and read it. It's sort of like a Gnostic story with the narrative economy of a fable with very little metaphysical juja on top of it. And it was a very important text for him because it allowed him, it resonates and connects and overlaps with the fish sign experience in a lot of very interesting ways, but it also shows him how he was reading his way, how he was turning to textuality as a way to not overwrite his experience, but rather articulate, bring it into more meaningfulness. Ted has already raised the question about Christianity, what the Christ is, and so I'm going to skip my little bit about that and about how Christ functions in this sequence. Again, it's sort of a Christ without content. It's kind of drawn down to this final image of fish sign and light. Fish sign and light. But I want to stay with that last thing. That's what I'll end with here. Is thinking a little bit more about this particular fish sign. So, as you know, the fish sign also often comes, and you've seen it on the back of cars. You know, as the fish sign, fights this evolutionary war with the Darwin sign and all the kind of permutations of this sort of ridiculous thing. That often comes with the Greek letters Exegesis, which is Greek for fish, but is also an acrostic for Jesus Christ, Son of God. So already we have this very interesting symbol. This fish sign that's drawn like a fish, says the word fish, but the word fish itself is a code for something else. Now, where did this sign come from? This fish sign was resurrected by Jesus freaks in the late 1960s. That is, by countercultural Christians. So whoever sold Dick the fish sign bumper sticker was emerging from a very peculiar and very fascinating moment in American religious history where strongly countercultural values infused a radical kind of revivalism. And it's really important to keep that revivalism in mind, and also the counterculture dimension of it, because Dick's Christianity is always deeply countercultural. Another dimension of this is the whole return to Rome, the idea that there's sort of this collapse of time. What's so fascinating about that, I mean, there's many, many fascinating things to say about that return to Rome. One is the way in which he intellectually returns to late antiquity in the ways that Ted has just given us a slice of, how that whatever happened in late antiquity was something that he felt himself directly connected with. But another aspect is the way in which for Christians, particularly strong evangelical Christians, that the proximity to life of Christ is incredibly important. Psychologically, they attempt to collapse the historical and cultural differences between our contemporary moment and the moment of Jesus. So in a way, Dick is just sort of bringing that, taking that just one step farther on the level of kind of historical ontology. Another aspect of this fish sign is that it's sort of part of Christian folklore that one of the sign was used by Christians to recognize one another. Dick mentions this in some of the letters or in the Exegesis, where the idea is that you thought that that Thomas over there was a Christian, so you'd like put one sign of the fish on the ground, which is just an arc, and then Thomas would finish off the other arc, making the fish sign, then you'd know that you were a secret Christian. There's absolutely no evidence for this. The fish sign was used by many different mystery religions, the Mithra, everybody used the fish sign. That's probably not the case. But what's important about it is the way in which it points to a kind of diagram of forces. We have these arcs that are a code, a symbol, a word, a sign, this kind of density of semiotics that was incredibly important to the way that Dick thought about VALIS and thought about what happened to him. And some of the most marvelous doodles that are in the Exegesis, that are in the published edition, is you see him permutate these images. So it's like the fish becomes a mouth, maybe a vagina dentata, becomes a DNA strip, and it's like he's taking this physical diagram and permuting it. And as it permutes and mutates and shifts and builds on itself and resonates and replicates and changes, each one of those suggests a different kind of dimension of this metaphysical revelation that he received. And this gives us a core, formal expression of how the exegesis works. Not its arguments, not the various scenarios, but the way it works as a model of thinking, as an expression of Dick's own thinking, which has to do with repetition, permutation, metamorphosis, and superimposition. Superimposition, a very, very key term. That's what happens when Rome and Orange County overlay each other. They are superimposed. The idea of superimposition is also a way to talk about precisely that comparative move that I started off, where something in the cult of Dionysus seems to connect with something in Amazonian shamanism, seems to connect with something in Paracelsus or Burma. And what makes them link? Well, from a certain angle, they're all superimposed. They seem to tell something like the same story. And Dick is alluding to this when he says that my experience of fish sign and light is like Burma. He says, like Burma, like Tagomi at the end. Like Burma, Jacob Burma, incredibly important figure in esotericism. No time to talk about it now except for the following tiny little tidbits. In many ways, he was the first genuinely modern mystic, which meant that his way of thinking philosophically is recognizably part of the modern turn. That is a post-Cartesian way of thinking. And indeed, Burma's model of sacred reality goes directly into Hegel and the idea of the dialectic. It's a very important source for a lot of later philosophical thinking in the West. And in many ways, he's a very kind of Dickian character. He was a sort of, a cobbler, working class guy. He was very melancholic. And he had this kind of model of a highly dynamic metaphysical system with some very serious darkness in it that threw one into the divine abyss. So there's something very Dickian about it, but particularly is that the lore, which may or may not be true, is that Burma's first metaphysical illumination was a glint of light off of a pewter dish. So when he says like Burma, he's doing a couple things. One is he's saying, my experience is like Burma's. He's also saying, I understand my experience by understanding Burma, i.e. by understanding the whole rich, interactive, VALIS-like history of esotericism, mysticism, and religious thinking. It's a superimposition across time. But then he adds that other bit, that particularly Phil Dickian bit, like Tagomi. Like Tagomi. Like a fictional character. Of course he's referring to the scene at the end of The Man in the High Castle where Tagomi finds himself in the park in San Francisco looking at Frank Frick's little silver pyramid. And that, he stares at it until it disgorges its spirit. Light. The same light that he's talking about here. And at that moment, Tagomi has a revelation. He moves into a real world, or at least our world, which may not be the real world. So what is Dick doing here? Well, Dick's saying, yes, it's another superimposition. After all, this light is reflected light. It's reflected off the fish sign. It's reflected off of the history of esotericism. It's reflected off of a fiction. It's a reflecting, bouncing, interacting light that goes into his eyes and goes into your eyes as well. But he's also giving you, in a way, the kind of secular, slightly disenchanting end to this account of his primal religious experience, which is that I know, on some level, that I set myself up for this. That he already wrote himself into his own religious experience by creating fictional models that set up, almost like in a staging way, what he would later undergo. And indeed, as you know, a lot of the exegesis has to do with him rereading his previous texts as secret signs of the revelation that he would later receive. So here we have another loop, a trans-temporal loop again, an orthogonal time kind of loop. Where does it start? Did the fiction set up his vision? Did the vision allow him to see the fiction as an allegory, the way that Christians would read the Old Testament as an allegory for the coming of Christ? You can't resolve it. It's indeterminate. But it's not indeterminate because I don't know. It's indeterminate because the system, the diagram of forces that bounce off of these various points creates a kind of cybernetic matrix, a dynamic that the exegesis itself attempts to show through its process, not its content, through its process. So it brings us to a very, very interesting, difficult kind of cybernetic mysticism, a kind of way of diagramming forces in a very, very powerful way that I think has a lot to say, not just for scholars and lovers of Phil Dick's work, but for people who are studying religion, religious experience, and mysticism in the postmodern age. So, thank you very much.